Betsy and Walter Stern Conference Center here at Hudson Institute. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson. This year, we celebrate a half-century of forward-looking policy analysis that promotes security, prosperity, and freedom. Central to our research agenda ever since the days of our founder, Herman Kahn, has been work on defense policy, guided in part by a belief that our nation's security can best be guaranteed if we prepare for threats that we may not even be aware of today. Last night, we honored Senator John Kyle with our signature Herman Kahn Award for his service to our nation, especially on issues of national defense. Fitting for the week in which we celebrate Veterans Day, Senator John McCain paid tribute both to his Arizona colleague and to the valor of Americans, veterans, and active armed forces. From the many veterans in attendance, we had the opportunity to learn firsthand of the incredible sacrifice of our returning heroes from Iraq and Afghanistan. These, as we all know, are challenging times for those of us concerned about national security. If the Congressional Deficit Supercommittee fails to come up with an agreement by its Thanksgiving deadline, our military budgets may be devastated by an automatic cut of $500 billion that would severely weaken our ability to meet future challenges. To analyze what these cuts might mean for our defense strategy, our armed forces, and our allies, we're honored to have Senator John Cornyn of Texas with us today. Those of us who know Senator Cornyn know that he is extraordinarily principled and focused as a public servant. He doesn't shy away from the hard work of paying attention to details while he maintains a drive to get things done. A lawyer by training who served as Attorney General of Texas before his election to the U.S. Senate and who serves with distinction on both the Armed Services and the Budget Committees, Senator Cornyn is the Vice Chairman of the Senate Republican Conference. He has graciously agreed to answer questions after his remarks, both from our audience here and from our audience online via Twitter at Hudson Institute. And our Director of Congressional Relations, Amy Kaufman, will moderate the question and answer session following the Senator's remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to present Senator John Cornyn.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ken. Let me thank you and Hudson for hosting today. And this is actually my inaugural speech at Hudson, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about something that's so important to an organization that for the last 50 years, through your researchers and scholars, has contributed so much to our public policy debates on a host of global issues. One of the things I like about Hudson is that you have a optimistic approach to the challenges we face. In Texas, we like to say we don't really recognize a problem, we recognize those as opportunities. And I think your focus on free markets, on free people that can develop innovative ideas and solutions and technologies to make us more prosperous and help in every region of the world, I think that is a great formula. But my topic today is defending defense. And it's not a coinage that I have created. It's one that I have adopted, one that the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and Foreign Policy Initiative have gotten together to spread the word on exactly how important our defense budget is to maintaining our strong America in the world. But the phrase defending defense is the theme that they've developed to coordinate their efforts, and I've simply borrowed that as a simple way to express my concerns for the budgetary challenges that we face in a still very dangerous world. The questions before us are stark but simple. What are the threats to Americans' peace and prosperity, and to the peace and prosperity of other free people? Who are America's allies, partners, and friends? And what is America's strategy to meet the threats in the dangerous world that we live in? What capabilities do we need to implement that strategy successfully? Every nation must ask those questions. They are the challenge for which governments were formed in the first place, including our own. But today, Americans must answer these questions in the context of a dynamic and sometimes confusing array of international challenges. Of course, there's a lot of good news, and we ought to dwell on that as long as we can. Osama bin Laden is no more, and Al-Qaeda has not successfully attacked the American mainland in the last 10 years, since 9/11. Muammar Gaddafi is gone, and other dictators and tyrants are under siege from their own people, who are boldly standing for liberty. The threat of major world war among the great powers seems more remote, at least in the short term, and the prospect of a nuclear confrontation, which was our constant fear during during the Cold War, seems much more unlikely now, although it's still a risk that we need to take seriously. So the case for optimism on our national security challenges is clear, but so are the causes for concern, and that's where I'd like to focus my remarks. Al-Qaeda remains a serious threat to the United States and other free people, as do other terrorist organizations, Hezbollah, Hamas, Lashkar-e-Taiba. We see the Arab Spring facing an uncertain future in places where people have risen up, but we're still waiting to see what sort of government and what sort of direction they will choose. In many instances, ill-prepared with the sort of democratic institutions that we take for granted here in America. So in Libya, Syria, Egypt, and elsewhere, we remain very concerned about the direction they will take. We know there are planned withdrawals of troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, which were ordered over the objections of some of our nation's military commanders, and with very little consultation with the elected leaders in Baghdad and Kabul. And those could also create power vacuums in each of those countries that could further destabilize not just those nations, but those regions of the world. Some nations already show signs of instability. Pakistan, which as we all know is nuclear armed. North Korea and Iran also remain serious proliferation risks. And just a few days ago, it was reported by the IAEA that Iran is now, quote, at the threshold of its own nuclear capability. China is modernizing its army and understating its investment in weapons. Russia may be reverting back to its old autocratic roots and its imperialist ambitions. And economic and financial uncertainty represent huge unknown risks for Europe, for China, and for literally every nation in the world living under a huge debt overhang and the uncertainty that comes with having to deal with the reality of living with overpromising what we can actually afford. So now more than ever, we need a coherent and compelling vision for America's role as a world leader. How can we meet the threats, mitigate the risks, and seize the numerous opportunities for the expansion of liberty and prosperity around the world, which is America's greatest gift to others? Despite the promise of such a vision when he took the oath of office in January of 2008, President Obama has seemed to be more aloof than engaged in U.S. foreign policy. In fact, earlier this year, one of his advisors was famously quoted as saying President Obama's global strategy was to lead from behind, which actually has a ring of truth to it. Sure, the president shows up now and again to spike the football when a major tyrant or terrorist is killed, but there's a sense that each of these decisions are ad hoc, not part of a strategy. And despite his remarkable rhetorical gifts, he doesn't seem interested in articulating a role for America in the world, either to the American people or to our friends, allies, and partners. So what kind of vision am I advocating for? Well, I'm talking about the kind of vision that the founders of our great country had when they wrote the Constitution and created the institution of the presidency to give our republic greater credibility abroad with other nations, both in war and in peace. It's the kind of vision that Harry Truman had during the early years of the Cold War, when he accepted America's role as the new leader of the free world and helped create the alliances, institutions, and capabilities that ultimately defeated the threat of communism. And it's the kind of vision that President George W. Bush provided when I first came to Washington in 2002, when we were focused on how to defeat the terrorist threat and inspire a new generation of democratic reformers in the Middle East and beyond. But today, 10 years after 9/11, we aren't seeing the same sort of strategic thinking that allows us to make good decisions about our investments in our national security. Now, Ken mentioned the role of the Select Committee, sometimes called the Super Committee. Others have called it the Super Duper Committee, but you get the drift. I've joked to others that this group of 12 have more power than any other group of Americans since the delegates met in Philadelphia in 1787 to amend the Articles of Confederation and came out with a new constitution. Now, I'm not suggesting we're going to get a new constitution, but they do have a lot of power. But seriously, I worry that our strategic thinking is being driven by dollars and cents more than common sense. As you know, the Budget Control Act passed by Congress the past summer created this super committee of 12 to come up with a way to reduce the deficit and to help our nation avoid the kind of financial catastrophe that we're seeing plague places like Greece and other countries in Europe. The super committee faces a deadline of November the 23rd, right before, notably, Thanksgiving, in which they will make their recommendations to both the House and the Senate. Of course, that's a little more than 2 weeks from now, and we'll all be required to vote on that majority vote, no amendments, by December the 23rd. If this process fails, and I hope and pray it does not, then a sequestration would take place. The base defense budget would be cut 14% in real terms over just 3 years, according to the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Even as our troops continue to fight multiple wars and other security threats continue to loom, as they always will, on the horizon. Keep in mind that these sequestration cuts to our national defense would be in addition to the cuts already made under the Budget Control Act, which are up to $489 billion over 10 years, and other efficiencies recommended by Secretary Gates, which are a little less than $180 billion over 5 years. What about the cuts that have already been made? What do they mean for our men and women in uniform? The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Greenert, gave us one example. He testified that since 2000, the number of ships in the fleet decreased by about 10%. Yet in the last 4 years alone, demand for carrier strike groups has doubled, and requests for amphibious ready groups grew by 70%. As a result, each ship is underway about 15% more than in 2000, lengthening deployments and making deployments more frequent. Fighting 2.5 wars over the last 10 years has put a great strain on the force, and we all recognize that. So this should really be a time for rebuilding and retraining and not retreating. But retreat is the only way to describe what would happen if our military forces are required to live under this sequestration process. For example, the United States Army currently has 100 maneuver battalions, but according to the House Armed Services Committee, the current round of defense cuts in the Budget Control Act could cut that to 78, from 100 to 78. And if sequestration were to occur, it would drop further to as few as 60, from 100 to 60. In the same way, the Navy currently has 288 ships in the fleet. That could drop to 263 under current law, and 238 if the sequestration were to take effect, from 288 to 238. And the Air Force, which currently has about 2,000 fighter aircraft, could face cuts of entire air wings, according to Secretary Panetta. These aren't just lower numbers. They're greatly reduced military capabilities to meet future and present threats. Don't take my word for it. Secretary Panetta has also strongly cautioned against further cuts to defense through the sequestration process. He said this mechanism would force additional cuts to defense of about $500 billion, or roughly $1 trillion in total, half from the sequestration, roughly half from the Budget Control Act. Cuts, he said, in my view, that would do catastrophic damage to our military, hollowing out the force and degrading its ability to protect our country. He went on to say it is a blind formula that makes cuts across the board and hampers our ability to align resources and strategy. General Ray Odierno, Chief of Staff of the Army, has said much the same thing. He said, cuts of this magnitude would be catastrophic to the military, and in the case of the Army, would significantly reduce our capability and capacity to assure our partners abroad, respond to crises, and deter our potential adversaries while threatening the readiness of our all-military force. Our military leadership is trained not to panic, but you can hear their frustration and you can hear grave concern in their voices that America's strategic commitments are being defined not by the requirements, but by budgets. They're frustrated that under the sequestration process, that cuts would be arbitrary and reckless because they would not reflect any strategic assessment of what military capabilities America really needs, but only how much money is available. I think we need to listen to our outstanding military leaders, both civilian and military, and that means giving them the tools they need and the resources they need to keep our nation safe. That means looking beyond the spreadsheet. We need to look at the map. We need to see what capabilities are developing in other countries around the world and what capabilities we, in turn, will need to meet, both to defend our interests and to deter potential adversaries. For example, China is developing a carrier killer ballistic missile that could destroy an entire aircraft carrier and therefore deny U.S. forces access to international waters that are within its range. So if we want to reassure our allies in Japan and South Korea that America will keep our commitments to them, if we want to prevent the military invasion of Taiwan, if we want to maintain freedom of movement for American forces in the Western Pacific, that means better defenses to counter long-range ballistic missiles like this new carrier killer and state-of-the-art submarines that can operate in environments where surface ships would be highly vulnerable, as well as a long-range bomber that can penetrate the most advanced air defense systems in the world for surveillance, reconnaissance, and destroy any target that's a threat to us. Another example is our ballistic missile defense. Iran has the largest inventory of ballistic missiles in the Middle East, and many military analysts believe that North Korea's ICBM is capable of reaching parts of the United States. So if we want to defend our homeland and our allies with the missile defense system, if we want to deter the risk of proliferation, then we will need to continue investing in missile defense technology, such as the Navy's SM-3 missile, the ground-based mid-course defense system, and the terminal high-altitude air defense system. What about America's ability to maintain air superiority in any conflict? Well, China and Russia already fly the highly capable Su-30 multi-role fighter and the Su-27 air superiority fighter, but they're not satisfied. They're developing fifth-generation stealth aircraft to oppose our F-22 Raptor and the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. So if we want Americans to fly better aircraft than their potential adversaries, if we want to deter other nations challenging America's air superiority, then we need to continue building the inventory of aircraft that can meet any threat. Here's the point. Other nations face economic challenges just like we do, yet they're making investments in military capabilities they think they need. China still has hundreds of millions of people living in poverty, yet they're making huge investments to upgrade their military forces. Iran has been willing to endure years of economic sanctions in order to pursue its nuclear weapons program. North Korea has literally been starving its own people and to feed its own military-industrial complex. Now, I don't want to see America get into an arms race with any nation, But if any nation wants to get into an arms race with the United States, I certainly hope President Obama intends to win it. I don't want to suggest that we can right now, here today, identify all of our potential adversaries in the years ahead. As Secretary Gates has said, our record of predicting where we will use military forces since Vietnam has been perfect. We have never once gotten it right. He added, there isn't a single instance from Grenada, Panama, the first Gulf War, Balkans, Haiti, you can keep going through the list, where we knew and planned for such a conflict 6 months in advance. So what am I for? How do I suggest we proceed? I say let's get our strategy right first. Let's see what the requirements are to keep America safe and to keep our commitments around the world and to make sure that we are the preeminent military force in the world. The Defense Department is still completing its comprehensive strategic review, which is sort of a midterm quadrennial defense review, but designed specifically to deal with the new budgetary environment we're living in. It will determine what the impact of the Budget Control Act will mean for our military capabilities. Without this analysis, without this strategic plan, Congress would simply be cutting blind, and we would not be cutting responsibly. So let's have the Congress debate what America's commitments and capabilities should be, and let's have the President make a consistent and thoughtful case for his vision, both to the American people and our friends in other nations. And then, once we have a sound strategy, let's make sure we resource it appropriately. Now, I don't want to suggest from anything I've said here that concerns about the way the Pentagon spends money should be disregarded. In fact, I'm telling you the opposite. We need to aggressively continue to fight waste, fraud, and abuse wherever we find it. One area that I think has a lot of opportunity is the financial mismanagement at the Department of Defense, such that the Department of Defense cannot even produce an auditable financial statement. Now, they're not required to do so technically until 2017. It's shocking that they can't do it now. But Secretary Panetta has said he wants to move that up from 2017 to 2014 because I think he recognizes, he said as much, that this is a real problem. So he's directed the Pentagon to become audit-friendly much more quickly, moving up the most significant deadline to 2014. The Pentagon also needs to carefully rethink the way it develops and acquires major weapons systems. Over the last decade, the Pentagon has approved purchases of a number of weapon systems and then canceled them at a cost of some $50 billion with very little to show for it. The Pentagon must also keep these programs on budget and on schedule, an incredibly difficult thing to do as we are developing military capability at the same time we're producing it. And the costs of this concurrency are enormous, a challenge we need to manage much better. So we need to make sure that our troops get the tools they need to complete their missions, and we must make sure the taxpayers gain confidence that we are spending every dollar on our national defense and national security wisely. Well, let me close on a note of optimism and hope. I firmly believe that our budget challenges can be met. America has been through tough times before, and we have always not just survived, we have thrived and we have prospered, and we have become the envy of the world. But as Ronald Reagan once said, there are no easy answers, but there are simple answers. We must have the courage to do what we know is morally right. What's morally right is to bring federal spending back to a level that we can actually afford without burdening the next generation under a mountain of debt. And I believe this nation has the moral courage to make simple choices, not easy choices, by doing right for our children and grandchildren. I also believe America's national security challenges can be met as well. The threats we see around the world are real, but so too is the power of liberty to transform adversaries into allies. How do I know that? Well, we've seen it with our very eyes. We've seen it in America's special relationship with the United Kingdom, from whom we declared our independence and won our liberty. We've seen it in America's alliances with Japan and Germany, against whom my father and other members of the greatest generation fought in World War II. And we're seeing it in Afghanistan and Iraq and across the Middle East, where millions of people still have a chance to secure their liberty, thanks to the sacrifice and determination of so many Americans who have fought against the tyrants and the terrorists. I trust all of you share that same optimism, and whether we do or not, I'm happy to answer a few questions.
Okay, I'm Amy Kaufman. I'm going to be moderating the question and answer session. We'll be taking about 20 minutes worth of questions. And as a moderator, I feel it only fair that I get the first question.
Sure.
So, Senator, as children, we all learned one of the basic points of the Constitution was to provide for the national defense. As a member of the Judiciary Committee and as a former judge, do you think that cutting our budget at this point, when there are so many threats to our nation, would be unconstitutional at this stage?
Well, I'm sorry to remind all of us that it's been more than 900 days since we've actually had a budget passed the United States Senate, which is one of the most fundamental acts that Congress needs to perform so we can determine what our priorities are, which national defense is number one, and then see what we can do, what things we need to do today, we have to do today, what things we'd like to do today, but we could put off to tomorrow, and those things that we maybe would like, which are not absolutely essential and we can do without. I think that's the biggest challenge we have, is there both the lack of the strategic vision that I mentioned earlier and a lack of an appropriate process where we can prioritize and make sure that national security is adequately resourced, and some of the other things that we pay a lot of money for are simply unnecessary, whether they're duplicative or whether there's things we could learn to live without. So I would hope we would never get to a situation where we'd have some court be called upon to decide the constitutionality. I think they would probably defer on that, and I think appropriately that is up to the political branches of government, and that's why we ought to be doing our job.
During the question and answer, I'd like everyone to limit their questions, 2 questions, not statements. And when you are called upon, if you could state your name and what organization you're representing, that would be very helpful. Okay, the gentleman in the back. Yep.
Senator, my name is Michael Zach. I wrote a history of the Republican Party. My question is, which member of Congress first proposed setting up the Select Committee? Which person?
Question is, who proposed the Select Committee? I believe it was Senator Reid who had the idea. As you recall, we were going through this very difficult process involving raising the debt ceiling, and there were a lot of efforts looking to try to find a sort of a mechanism to go forward, and this was the one that we ended up with. It certainly was not have been my first choice. I would love to see a return in the Senate to something we call the regular order, which is actually this very interesting process whereby bills are filed, they're referred to committees, committees have hearings, they mark up the bills, they allow senators to offer amendments and actually vote on those, and then they're voted out of committee, and then they come to the floor, we have debate and amendments, and the majority will prevails. What a novel concept. That's called the legislative process. We have not had that for a long, long time, and I think we've suffered from it. Because when we see big and important things happen, it's just the point of the health care bill is one of them. People are still learning of unintended consequences of that 2,700-page bill that was passed by a single-party vote. So I think whenever you have expedited processes like this, there's an opportunity, I think, to do some things that should be done. For example, entitlement reform, which can only be done on a bipartisan basis, but there's a lot of risk to it, and I'm concerned about it.
The gentleman on the end, right there.
Hi, my name is Travis Corson. I'm with the Center for Security Policy. A lot of folks have tried to set up this supercommittee debt deal as having to make the false choice between defense cuts or tax hikes. How do we get ourselves out of that trap? And how do we really use this as a way to make real reform in spending and get ourselves on the right spending track?
Well, I agree to the extent that you're hearing a lot of people saying they're not interested in doing any other kind of business unless we can raise taxes. But I would just refer back to what President Obama himself said in the December of 2010. He said raising taxes while the economy is struggling is the last thing you would want to do on the very people we're depending upon to create jobs and to grow the economy. I think that's still true, and raising more taxes and more revenue simply to keep spending more money that we don't have is a terrible idea. We've seen what's happened in Greece, Italy, Spain, Ireland. We need to pay attention because we are going through, we've seen a mountain of consumer debt and corporate debt shift onto the government's balance sheet. And at some point, beyond depressing economic growth, it creates a huge risk that we're going to have to pay more to convince somebody to buy our debt. And just a 1% increase in what we have to pay to convince somebody to buy our debt is $1.3 trillion over 10 years. In other words, it would wipe out whatever the super committee would do. But I think it's a false choice between national security or tax increases. It's much more complicated than that, and I think there's a lot of ways we could do meaningful things on a bipartisan basis. And I would just point out the president's own bipartisan commission, Simpson-Bowles. It's not everything in there I like, but it was a real and substantial effort to try to address the problem, not just of our current debt, but also our unfunded liabilities in Medicare and Social Security. And you know what? If America goes broke, we not only won't be able to provide the safety net programs that people understandably are concerned about, we will be putting ourselves at greater risk from a national security standpoint because we won't be able to afford the sorts of things we need in a very dangerous world.
Gentleman, second row.
Hi, my name's Stephen Reif. I work for a defense contractor. And as you know, if the super committee fails, God forbid, the sequestration will not happen until FY13, giving almost a full year to potentially change the law. There's been a couple reports the last few days about waivers. Senator Lindsey Graham, kind of how feasible do you think that option actually is to defend the defense budget?
Well, if heaven forbid the committee fails to meet its targets and the sequestration kicks in, I'm going to be all in trying to fix the cuts to the Defense Department, because I agree with Secretary Panetta, I agree with the Army Chief of Staff, Ray Odierno, and others, that we simply cannot ask the Defense Department to bear those sort of costs without making ourselves more vulnerable to our adversaries. But I think failure really should not be an option. I think what would it say to not only the American people who are depending upon their elected representatives to solve these very real problems together, what would it say to the markets? What would it say to the world about America's seriousness of dealing with these problems? We've already seen a downgrade in our credit rating by one credit agency. So there are a lot of really bad things that could kick in with the sequestration. But if heaven forbid that were to happen, I would, for one, would be doing everything I can to undo it, to make sure that the Defense Department did not have to deal with these sort of draconian cuts.
Doug?
Doug Feith, a fellow here at the Hudson Institute. Senator, you expressed a general concern about the effects on defense capabilities if these major new cuts occur. I'd just like to invite you to get a little more specific. What are the kinds of scenarios that you're actually worried about? And how do you answer people who make the point that the American defense budget is so much larger than that of other countries that it shouldn't be terribly worrisome to cut it substantially. If we do cut it substantially, more specifically, what are the kinds of threats that you think that that subjects us to?
Well, Doug, as you know, our defense budget is roughly equivalent, I think, to the next 22 countries combined. But the rest of the world depends on the United States for their own security, both in their region and their country. And I think, we don't want to start an arms race when people doubt our willingness to step in and to provide stability and peace, because that could in itself be destabilizing. On the other hand, all I have to do is think about our recent experience with Taiwan to say, our allies and friends, notwithstanding the fact that the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act requires the U.S. government to provide Taiwan with defensive weaponry, I don't believe we've lived up to that commitment. I've tried hard to force the administration to deal with the sale of the F-16s, which will merely replace aging aircraft. But I think we need a strategy which helps our friends and allies protect themselves, so maybe reducing the requirement that we do so for them. But we don't want to see a collapse of America's security umbrella in regions where other countries decide, well, we're going to have to get a nuclear weapon ourselves. Of course, we see that in the Middle East with concerns over Iran and among others. So this is complicated, but it's not something we ought to be doing based on how much money we can bring to the table. We ought to look at our security interests. We ought to examine this complex situation in a way that is smart and makes sense, and then figure out how we're going to fund that as a priority.
I want to go online for a second and take a question we have online, which is, Senator, don't we have enough money to fund our own country and protect ourselves, and maybe not fund other countries that don't appreciate our efforts as much?
Well, I think we thought before 9/11 that we were somehow safe within our borders, national borders, and that proved not to be the case. And it's not just state actors anymore. It's cyber warfare. It's terrorists who want to try to steal a nuclear weapon. That's, of course, the concern about instability in Pakistan, is their nuclear weapons. And so I don't think America can pull into our shell and just within our shores and say, we'll protect ourselves, but we're really not too concerned about the rest of the world. That's not who we are, and that's, I don't think, in our national security interest either, because there's a lot of bad things that will come visit us if we neglect them abroad, and that's why it's so important to stay engaged with other countries to help them to develop the capacity, as we have in Afghanistan and Iraq, to provide security for themselves. But we ought not to be pulling back. We ought not to be either to our shores or pulling our troops back according to a political timetable, but based upon conditions on the ground and the capability of these countries to defend themselves.
Gentleman, third row.
So I'm Tony Liao from Central News Agency, Taiwan. I have a question about, we know you are a strong supporter of arms sales to Taiwan in the past years. And what does that mean in this special period of time when China's military grows so fast to United States and Asia Pacific region? And Obama administration keeps saying in the past 3 years, arms sales to Taiwan is much greater than before. But somehow Taiwanese things cry out for something they want and they need, but cannot be satisfied. So what's your opinion about that? Thank you.
Well, as you know, you look at the aircraft available to the Chinese government versus Taiwan, and it's no contest. And a lot of the fleet that currently comprises their capacity in Taiwan is made up of French Mirages and F-5s, and these are quickly coming out of offline because of the difficulty in getting spare parts and maintaining them. So what the president and the administration have proposed is providing upgrades to the existing F-16As and B series and making them more capable. but indeed in the process, they will not replace the aging Mirages and F-5s, and they will take some of the current F-16As and B series offline while they are upgrading them with these new packages. So this is a very bad response to a legal responsibility the United States has, and it's not just the way we've treated Iran. This is a message to others around the world that if you're a friend of the United States, we are not going to be a reliable partner, which indeed emboldens the world's bullies, and it tells other countries that the United States is unreliable.
Gentleman in the first row.
Tom Curry with MSNBC.com. Senator, there's a lot of concern about jobs everywhere. Can you talk about what effect the automatic cuts in defense would have, if they were to occur, on companies and workers, especially in your state? And also, are you implying that if the Joint Committee is going to come up with a solution, most of it, almost entirely, will have to come from entitlement spending, because you've ruled out you are against tax increases?
Mm-hmm. Well, Tom, I think I was speaking principally what would happen if there was a sequestration, but I think defense has already paid its fair share through the Budget Control Act and what Secretary Gates has done through gaining greater efficiencies during his last months in office. But I think entitlements, of course, are unfunded liabilities in the future. They have not generally contributed largely to our current debt, but they are something that is going to get worse and worse as we get fewer and fewer people working and paying into the system, and more people getting older and older and making demands upon the system. So I'm suggesting that that's important, not from a deficit, so much from a deficit and debt reduction, but from the standpoint of dealing with these burgeoning liabilities that have to be met. And the only time you can deal with those is on a bipartisan basis. We saw that when President Bush proposed changes to Social Security that were rejected by the other party, and the only time this can be done, a la Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, among other examples. So I think it's a great opportunity. And I would say on the tax side, I think what Republicans have said is we don't believe that tax rate increases on the very people we're depending upon for job creation and growth of the economy is a good idea, particularly during these fragile economic times. But that's not to say we don't believe in, and I certainly do, in tax reform. Our corporate tax system makes America uncompetitive globally, and indeed multinational companies that earn income abroad leave that money abroad rather than be taxed twice. And what that does is it encourages them to create jobs and to make investments abroad rather than here at home. I think that's just the opposite of what it should be. So I think we ought to eliminate deductions and loopholes. The Simpson-Bowles Commission talked broadly about tax expenditures and the opportunities that are provided there. I believe some of the select committee is looking at caps on the amount of deductions as a way of generating additional revenue without raising tax rates. And in fact, we could lower marginal tax rates by eliminating some of those tax expenditures. That's something we're for, and that I think could be a source of revenue, as well as get the economy to start growing again, which would help us close the deficit.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions from the audience and one more from online. The gentleman 6 rows back with the beard, I think, had his hand up before.
Modern technology. Speaking of technology, my name's Pat Smith. I'm unaffiliated. I'm a citizen, taxpayer, and a veteran. Your strategic concerns seem to be hardware first, hardware centric in a sense. When most of us know, when you look at budgets, personnel is a driving cost. What are your thoughts as to modifications within DoD as to personnel? Because it is indeed a majority expense.
what I intended to convey is that I think we need to look at what the strategy should be first, and then resource it. But you're right that personnel is very expensive, and that's not only our active duty military, it's also our retired personnel and veterans and their families, and healthcare costs, which are rising at much faster than the inflation rate, are causing the Pentagon to spend more and more money on personnel and those related costs. And of course, there is invariably a tension between what the priorities should be. But I think my preference would be to ask the Pentagon to come back to Congress with the best way to balance those competing interests, and we should leave it to the experts to at least make the first recommendation to us, rather than to have Congress say, well, you can cut here, cut there, and try to micromanage the Defense Department budget. It's too big and too complex, and the consequences of getting it wrong are too serious, I think, for Congress to micromanagement. So I think we ought to say what the parameters are, but those parameters ought to be dictated by our strategic interests, not how much money we want to grudgingly provide national security. But then once that's done, to work with our military leadership, both uniform and civilian, to try to make sure that they're meeting their targets in terms of the strategy.
Okay. The gentleman in the white shirt and the blue tie.
I'm Aaron from Raptor Strategies, and with the possible budget cuts, do you think that the Pentagon will increase their reliance on non-combat services from contractors?
The question is, will the Pentagon continue depending, as they already do, on outside contractors? What I would say, they have to pay them too, right? So that money has to come from somewhere, and presumably it would come from the Pentagon's budget. So I think you'll see a contraction, both in terms of spending at the uniform military service, but also in terms of paying outside contractors to do a number of functions. I don't see any other way around that.
Another question we just got online was, Senator, not talking about budget cuts, but budget spending. Where would you put more money into the defense budget?
Well, I'd be willing to make a investment in financial management so the Pentagon actually knows where the money is that it has, and make sure that it's being spent efficiently and wisely. I know there are examples that I won't go into here, where literally huge sums of money have literally been lost in the system, and I think we need the sort of transparency and accountability that comes from financial management reform. And I'm delighted, I asked Secretary Panetta during his confirmation hearing if this was a commitment that he shared, and he said he did, and I think he's followed through on that. And I'm pleased that he has decided to move up the target for producing an auditable financial statement and gaining that sort of efficiency and transparency and accountability by 2014. It's long overdue, and I think that will help the Pentagon manage the money it does have in a much more efficient and cost-effective way.
And the last question. The gentleman all the way in the back in the blue shirt. Standing against the wall.
Thank you. Eddie Walsh with The Diplomat. So you mentioned our commitment to our Asian allies, and I wanted to raise the question of Japan. So they have pressed hard in the past for F-22 exports. They've also, some scholars in Japan have questioned the U.S. commitment to mutual deterrence. And so I wanted to raise this question with you. As you look at Japan, how serious have we been to living up to the commitments to ensure their defense? And would you re-examine the opportunity to export the F-22 to Japan at this point, given that it's at a fixed cost and could be provided to them at a moment's notice?
Well, to me, it's a win-win when we help provide our allies around the world, like Japan, with the military weapon systems, aircraft, and the like, that they can then enhance their own defensive capability. It takes some of the load off of us, and it also, and I know this isn't the primary thrust, but I can't help but think about the jobs that it creates here in America. We are the world's leader when it comes to military equipment, and we ought to look at opportunities to sell that to our friends and allies around the world to help them enhance their capacity to defend themselves, and that will perhaps relieve some of the responsibility on us. So I haven't looked at the F-22 specifically in that context, but I certainly will. But I think anything we can do to help our allies help themselves and take the load off of us while creating jobs here in America is a good thing.
I want to thank Senator Cornyn for coming today and sharing his thoughts on this topic. And we will all be waiting anxiously for November 23rd to see what these recommendations are. And hopefully our country will still be the same on November 24th. So thank you very much, and appreciate you being here.
Nice to see you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for coming. And look, anytime
Senator Kyle, I'm glad to hear you all get that. He's one of my great guy. Yeah, we're gonna miss him.
Okay, I'll be in touch with the rest. Thank you very much.